The sun had been a merciless god for 3 days straight, and by now it had stripped the cowboy of every shred of strength and pride. His shirt clung to his back in crusted salt, his hat long gone, his eyes narrowed to slits under the white glare of the Mojave sky. The land stretched forever, a trembling sea of sand and stone with no promise of shade or water. His horse lay somewhere behind him, a carcass already claimed by flies. He'd said a few words over it, maybe a prayer, maybe a curse, but the desert swallowed both alike. He had been chasing a dream when he rode out here. Gold, or maybe redemption, he could not tell the difference anymore. A man running from his past always thought he'd find salvation in empty land. But the desert had a way of stripping illusions faster than anything. It tore you down to nothing until all that remained was thirst. Now every step felt like dragging his soul across glass. His tongue was cracked and swollen, his throat scraped dry as old bark. The canteen slapping at his side had been empty since sunrise yesterday. He had tried to sip the last drop, but the desert wind had stolen it before it reached his lips. He could barely remember his name now, only flashes of a saloon, a woman's laughter, a gunshot that might have changed everything. When he stumbled, he fell face first into the burning sand, the taste of dust filling his mouth. The world began to tilt. He tried to push himself up, but his arms trembled and folded. His breath came in short, wheezing gasps, the kind a dying man gives before silence takes over. The sun seemed to pulse, alive and cruel. His vision blurred until shapes melted into gold and white. He thought he saw movement, a figure, dark and distant, standing against the shimmer. He blinked, but the mirage held. At first he thought it was death itself come for him, tall and still, watching from the ridge. But then the shape moved closer. A figure stepped out of the waves of heat, a woman, barefoot, her long dark hair braided tight, her skin the color of the desert earth itself. She moved with the patience of someone who'd lived long enough to understand the sand's rhythm. The cowboy couldn't lift his head to look clearly. All he could manage was a rasping sound. Water. The word cracked apart in his throat. The woman stood over him for a long time, her shadow cutting across his sunburned face. Her eyes were sharp, unreadable, the eyes of someone who'd lost too much to trust easily. Around her neck hung a small pouch of leather and beads, and she carried a clay flask against her hip. She crouched, her movements quiet and deliberate, studying him like one would study a wounded animal. He tried again, his cracked lips bleeding when he spoke. "Please, water." Her gaze flicked to his canteen, then back to his face. "The desert takes those who come uninvited," she said softly, in accented English, the words heavy and measured. He wanted to answer, but his mouth couldn't form words anymore. His eyes rolled back, and his body sagged. She hesitated, just long enough to feel the weight of choice. She had no reason to help him. He was one of the white men who had taken everything from her people, her husband, her village, her peace. And yet, something in the ragged way he clung to life stirred something buried deep in her chest. Not pity, she had burned past pity years ago, but memory. Memory of the man she had loved once, who had fought and died under the same cruel sun. She untied her flask and tipped it toward his mouth. The last of her water, barely a mouthful. The drops slid past his lips, but his throat convulsed and refused to swallow. He coughed weakly, choking on what little life was offered. His skin was fever-hot, his heartbeat erratic under her fingers. The widow looked toward the horizon. No clouds, no wind, no promise of rain. She could walk away and no one would ever know. The desert would cover him by morning. Yet she stayed, kneeling beside him as the heat shimmered around them. She touched his cheek, then his chest, feeling the weak flutter of his heart. His eyes opened slightly, pale blue under the dust, and for a moment he seemed to see her clearly. Confusion flickered there, followed by something like awe. "Angel," he murmured. She shook her head slowly. "No angel, just a woman left behind." He didn't understand, but his fingers twitched toward hers, a pleading gesture more instinct than thought. She looked down at her own body, at the life it still carried though everything else around her was dead. She whispered an old prayer, one her mother had spoken in the tongue of her people, asking the spirits for mercy on both the living and the dying. Then she pulled him into her arms. His head rested against her chest, his skin burning, his breath shallow. Under the shade of her worn buckskin cloak, she guided him gently, steadying him as he sought what his body begged for. She closed her eyes against the sting of tears she hadn't shed in years. In that moment, she was no longer the widow of a warrior or the outcast of a tribe, She was simply life refusing to let death have its way. The first sound he heard was the crackle of fire. Not loud, not fierce, just steady, like a heartbeat. When the cowboy opened his eyes, the world had changed colors. The angry white of the sun was gone, replaced by the soft blue of morning. The air was cool enough to breathe again. His vision swam for a moment before settling on the woman sitting a few feet away, her back straight, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She was tending a small fire, the smoke curling lazily into the sky. Around her, the desert stretched vast and empty, but the emptiness felt different now, less like death, more like quiet. The cowboy lifted his hand to shade his eyes. Every muscle in his body ached. His throat burned, but when he tried to swallow, he found it wasn't dry anymore. He touched his chest, the coarse fabric of his shirt stiff with salt and dust, and realized his heart was still beating. "You should not move yet," the woman said without turning. Her voice was calm, the kind that didn't need to rise to be obeyed. He froze, then sank back against the sand. You're real," he whispered hoarsely. She glanced at him over her shoulder, one dark brow lifting. "The desert makes men see spirits. I am no spirit." He tried to smile, but his lips cracked. Didn't figure angels walked barefoot. Her expression didn't change, but he thought he saw something flicker behind her eyes, something not quite anger, not quite humor. She turned back to the fire, feeding it a few more twigs. The silence stretched again, filled only by the wind whispering through the dunes. After a while, she said, "You would have died by sundown. The sand was already taking you." "I owe you," he rasped. "Don't rightly know how to pay for something like that." "There is no debt," she said simply. "You live, that is enough." He shifted, propping himself up on his elbows. The movement sent pain shooting through his shoulders, but he forced himself upright. She turned toward him finally, her eyes narrowing in warning. The light caught in her hair, black as obsidian, tied back in two long braids streaked with dust. There was strength in her face, the kind carved by loss and endurance, not time. He met her gaze, struggling for words. What do I call you?" For a moment she didn't answer. Her hands rested on her knees, fingers still as stone. "Names are for those who still belong to something," she said quietly. "Tribe, home, man, I belong to none." He hesitated. "Then I'll call you what you are." She looked at him sharply. "And what am I?" "The widow," he said. Her eyes darkened, but she didn't correct him. She turned back to the fire, stirring the ashes. "You are far from your people, cowboy." He gave a faint laugh, dry as wind. "Ain't got people no more. Left the last of 'em back in Yuma after a card game went bad. Guess I figured the desert couldn't be worse than a bullet in the back." "You were wrong," she said. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, I was." They sat in silence for a time. The sun crept higher, washing the desert in gold. She took a handful of roasted mesquite beans from a small leather pouch and handed them to him without a word. He took them, careful not to touch her fingers. The food was bitter, but it was the best thing he'd ever tasted. When he finished, he looked at her again. "Why'd you help me?" Her gaze didn't waver. "Because once, someone helped me. Before he died." He didn't need to ask who. The way she said it, the quiet ache in her tone, it told him enough. "Your husband," he murmured. She gave a small nod. "He was a warrior. Strong, proud." The white men came. There was fighting. When it was over, the ground drank his blood. "I buried him myself." Her eyes lifted to the sky. "Since then, I walk where he walked. The desert remembers him better than people do." The cowboy looked down. "I'm sorry." She tilted her head slightly. "You did not kill him." "No, but maybe a man like me did." That made her study him for a long time. There was something raw in her stare, not hatred exactly, but the memory of it. "Perhaps," she said finally. "But if I had wanted revenge, I would have let you die." He met her gaze, and for the first time, there was no fear in him. Just a quiet respect. "Then maybe the desert sent you to forgive us all," he said. She gave a soft sound that might have been a laugh, or maybe the desert wind playing tricks. "The desert does not forgive," she said. "It only gives and takes." He nodded, understanding more than he could say. The fire popped between them, and a thin curl of smoke rose into the morning air. After a while, he spoke again. "You got anywhere to go?" "No," she said. "I follow the wind. It takes me where I am needed." He leaned forward slightly. "Then stay a while. I ain't strong enough to ride, and," he hesitated. "It's good to hear a voice that ain't my own." She regarded him for a long moment, then looked toward the distance where the dunes rolled into the horizon. When you can walk, you will leave. That is how it should be. Maybe, he said, but right now, it feels like you're the only thing keeping me alive. Her eyes softened, though she tried to hide it. You talk too much for a dying man. Maybe talkin's the only thing I got left, he said with a faint smile. She didn't answer, but her silence no longer felt cold. The desert around them was waking, the sky brightening, a hawk circling high overhead, the faint rustle of something alive beneath the sand. The cowboy leaned back, watching her from where he lay. There was a stillness about her, the kind that came from surviving what others couldn't.